Hello everyone, I'm Florencia Minuzzi, and thanks for coming to my talk, Che, is this English? Implying one language in another. First, we'll start with a very quick overview of who I am and why I'm giving this talk. Then we'll cover implying one language in another using words, going beyond words, and thinking about player friction. We'll be doing all this in 15 minutes, so it'll be a quick tour of useful things to consider and implement. Spoilers, if you work in translation or localization, or if you've thought about how to represent accents in written form, what I'm about to say might already be familiar to you. But I hope to add another perspective to what you know, and you're always welcome to share your own ideas in the chat. Why am I giving this talk? Well, this crude map on the right shows everywhere I've lived until the age of 13. I was born in Buenos Aires, the capital of Argentina, and when I moved to Mexico at 6, I found out how strong my accent sounded to other Spanish speakers. I started learning English there as well, first at a bilingual school and then at an American school, and by the time I was 11 and living in the US, I would only speak Spanish with my family and a few friends. So, as you might imagine, I have experience and strong views about languages and accents, how they're perceived and what they can communicate. More recently, I've been working on a game called Elemental Flow, which is set in a Solarpunk version of Buenos Aires called Jacarandá, but the game was created from the ground up in English. While Clara, the main character, was raised there, she's been studying abroad for years, so returning home is a bit of a shock. Elemental Flow involves Clara finding her place in the world, so I needed to make sure the setting didn't feel just like set dressing, and language is a big part of that. So let's start by talking about the words themselves. Words are obviously very important for a script, so we'll go through this section in parts. In order to suggest one language in another, you can directly reference which languages are being spoken, think about the character's grammar and proficiency in different situations, use words from another language, translate commonly used phrases, and figure out how to convey accents. So let's break each of these down. Our first, more straightforward approach is to use direct references to the language or languages being spoken, or which languages your characters can speak. Of course, to do something like that, it has to sound natural in the conversation. But if you seed this information early, it'll help players understand smaller nods that you make further down the line. In the examples here, we have Nikki, girlfriend to the main character Clara. She's from our Solarpunk version of Singapore, visiting Jacarandá for the first time. During a conversation about schooling, she mentions knowing Malay, English, and Mandarin. So if she uses terms in those languages later, the player might remember why. And while Nikki speaks some Spanish, she worries she won't be able to understand Clara's grandmother because of her dialect. This tells you the language is not monolithic and sets up any later misunderstandings that may occur. Another useful approach is to use a character's proficiency in a language, by their choice of words and grammar, to convey their level of expertise in it. And a great way to do that is to have contrasting conversations. For example, when Nikki and Clara are alone, they speak in English, which they're both fluent in. It's natural for deep conversations to be more effortless. But when Nikki talks to Clara's grandmother, she's speaking Spanish, which she's still learning, and dealing with a different dialect, so it's a struggle to convey complicated meanings. You can do this even with the text being in just one language. Use pauses, awkward word choices, and grammar mistakes in a way that feels realistic, but without slowing things down too much. In this example, Nikki hesitates and makes a mistake I've seen someone else make, thinking confiar means confide, when instead it means trust. Even with those techniques, though, you still want to use words from another language. Names of people and places on their own can set the stage. If I say Clara is going home to Jacarandá, that already tells you something. This applies to word frequency as well. In Jacarandá, as in Buenos Aires, people drink mate all the time. So while the word does exist in English, the fact that it comes up so much makes a difference as well. You can also use whole terms or even sentences, depending on the context. In one example, I talk about the game Tutti Frutti. It's what we played during rainy days as a kid. Take a piece of paper and a pen and see who can come up with the most words starting with any given letter. Now, you might not know it by this name, but the pop-up note in the game explains how the game works. Maybe you know it by another name, like categories, and so the connection is made. These pop-up notes I'm referencing from Elemental Flow have actually been a great way to add context when there isn't a natural-sounding way in our dialogue-heavy game to do so otherwise. We use it for other things, like explaining Solarpunk terminology, adding humor, or changing the tone, but they've also been instrumental in the context of language. You can also use what I'd call touchstones of a language or accent, something that is used so frequently or differently that on its own, it can tell you what's being spoken. In English, this might mean the difference between a character saying y'all and another character saying lads. Spanish characters in an English medium might say Dios mío early to clue you in. But of course, this varies in effectiveness depending on your source language and the audience. Growing up, all of my dubbing was in Mexican Spanish, and that's what you hear most often in US media, and thanks to its export of media, the rest of the world. So I don't have certain shortcuts that are more widely known by English speakers. For example, while some might expect Clara's grandmother to call her mija, my grandparents never used that word. Instead, we express affection with diminutives, so she would call Clara Clarita. I hope players will get it, even if it's not exactly what they expect. What is true to Buenos Aires is, for example, using the word che to catch someone's attention or start a conversation. It's so ubiquitous that to Spanish speakers, it's a very quick shortcut to our accent. But even if you don't know what it means, it's a frequent reminder that there's another language at play here. I also find sayings and phrases to be a really colorful way to interact with languages. I like comparing phrases that convey a similar meaning. It's funny, but also telling whether you think one bird in the hand is worth 2 in the bush or 100 in the sky. In the case of Elemental Flow, I used a note to explicitly call out comparing apples and pears to apples and oranges. You don't always need a parallel phrase, though, if it still makes a kind of sense. For example, if I say, "We're out of time, let's leave the rest in the inkwell," you might picture unused ink left for another time. So even if you don't know what it means, it can be an interesting, funny, or poetic turn of phrase. Part of the work that these do, aside from being engaging, is to keep reminding players that other languages are still in play, even though the text continues to be in English. Alright, let's wrap up the section on words by talking about accents and how to convey them. If you've written or read anything where accents are represented, you might notice the way it's done varies across a broad spectrum, with subtle word choices on one end and an almost phonetic reproduction of sound on the other. Personally, I tend to be on the subtle word choice side of the spectrum, although I pepper them in often enough that I hope they add up over time. And of course, there's no wrong choice as long as you're consistent. But I found it to be an extra challenge when I chose to, perhaps unwisely, convey a Spanish accent in a work that is entirely in English. I've talked a little about dialects and accents with Nikki and Clara's grandmother, but it also comes up when Nikki talks to Eduardo, here on the left. His native language is Portuguese, so his Spanish has a Portuguese accent. In this short optional skit, Nikki remarks on the differences between his accent and Clara's. Being someone very musical, Nikki enjoys breaking down in detail how different his voice sounds to Clara, and gives me a chance to make a small dig at my own accent. No one of these tools or considerations will get you perfect results on their own, if such a thing is even possible. But by adding them where appropriate, based on the needs of your language and game, you can create a holistic feeling of being immersed in a language or being at the intersection of multiple languages. Having talked about the text itself, I want to touch upon the effect it has on player friction. Many people playing Elemental Flow will be faced with a setting and terms they're not used to. Adding a language enriches the game, but it is not costless. It can add friction to your text. Now, friction is a great tool in game design and writing. It can make players slow down, question things, even change their mind. But for those same reasons, it can make them dislike the game or put them off playing it altogether. This could be the topic of a whole conference, but to make this super simple in the time we have, here's one great question you can ask yourself. Is this friction a chance for players to enjoy something new or just an annoyance? There is no one approach to please all players, but you can emphasize the positives of friction by adding as many layers of enjoyment as you can. Make it interesting, teach them something new, give them a feel for the culture, make it humorous, emotionally resonant, have it teach you something about a character. As with good writing in general, the more layers you have, the more readers can get out of it. You may also find places to showcase language and culture which don't involve so much friction. This might mean having small references which don't change your understanding of the work, or inserting little nods to language in an otherwise lighthearted, easy-flowing conversation. It's similar to using humor or levity to give players a break from tension. In Elemental Flow, we do this via short optional skits that happen in Clara's house, letting you spend time with the characters as they talk about mundane things, like Clara's love of cheese and how that's seen across different cultures. I've talked a lot about words, but I want to wrap things up by looking at games as the form of multimedia that they are. I don't have time to cover every way you can embed your language into your game, so I'll only mention a few here. But the important part is to use everything at your disposal to immerse players into your world, language and all. If you have voicing, even just a couple of lines, there are some really effective uses for them. I like saying the name of the characters and places early. For example, I started this talk by mentioning Clara, not Clara, going home to Jacarandá. That way, you've set the right pronunciation for them before an unintended one sets in. You can also include language in your visuals if it's appropriate for your location. If players are surrounded by a language, it's easier to shake them out of feeling like everything is happening in English. Here on the right, for example, you can see the word biblioteca in one of our backgrounds. UI is another thing you can use very effectively depending on your game. Use icons, colors, or fonts to indicate language or language switching based on your game's needs. Think about games that use language interestingly and how they convey that. I'm sure in this audience you each have a favorite translation game. Find places for additional text or context and see if you can build that into your world. And finally, I want to end with a request. Try something new. There's no right way to convey a language, and what works for one game may not work for others. But as with good design, think about your game and its needs. Find examples from other games, or this talk, but tailor them to what you're trying to convey, the world you're trying to make, the characters you want to bring to life. Alright, that's it for me. Thank you very much for listening. Gracias totales.